Hello, everyone, and welcome to this AFM InFocus webinar. My name is Martin Webia, and I'm part of the team that provides student support here at ACCA. And this session today is designed to support your preparation for the Advanced Financial Management exam. And we are stepping in the mind of the marker. And for that session, I'm very pleased to be joined by expert tutor Andrew Moore. So thank you so much, Andrew, and a very warm welcome to you as well. Now, before I hand over to Andrew, I'd just like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, there are a number of buttons that you can use. You will see a help icon on the left, and that provides resources and information to help you resolve any technical issues that you might experience. There are icons for the slides and the media player. You'll need to see this during the webinar, so please ensure that you have selected them. There is also an attendee chat function, which will enable you to engage with fellow webinar attendees. Now that icon is on the right-hand side, and please do note that that's a publicly visible chat, so do not share any personal details, phone numbers, or email addresses. Now, there's also an icon that looks like a file symbol, and that has a list of all the resources relevant to today's webinar, including direct links and a PDF version of the slides that we will be using for the session. You can always rearrange your screen to suit you and resize the windows in case you need to. And if at any point you can't hear what we are saying or see the visuals, please do refresh your browser. Now, if you've registered for this webinar, you will receive an email in the next 24 hours with details on how you can listen to the recording. So don't worry much if you miss out on anything or you have any technical issues. The recording will be available for you to go over again. Now, I'm going to hand over to Andrew in a moment. And if you'd like to ask us a question, please use the Q&A button, which is accessible on your screen. And do put in your questions bright and early. We have a team in the back end that will be responding to your questions as the webinar progresses. So please don't wait for the last minute to send in your question. If you can, please put it in early, and we'll try as much as possible to respond to as many questions as we possibly can within the time that we have. So looking forward to the session. I'm sure there's going to be lots of great insights. And now over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thanks for having me. Thanks, nice to be here. I'm looking forward to running through some of the insights for the mind of the marker. So hi guys, thanks ever so much for joining live, and you guys watching the recording, welcome along as well. So here's a little bit about me. I won't take up too much time, but this is me. So my name's Andrew Moore. I am an expert tutor for ACCA in the subject of AFM. A little bit of my backstory. So I qualified as a chartered accountant at PwC up in Leeds in the UK. I then moved down to the south of England, the far preferable bit of the UK, to join Kaplan at London, where I worked for over 10 years, including some management roles and a few other bits at Kaplan. I then have gone freelance, so now I do lots of my own things, including working with ACCA, doing things like this. Also doing some work with ACCA, supporting students in Africa, which has been great, and doing the debriefs, which went live today, actually, as it happens, and we'll talk about that later. So these days I'm now freelancing. I'm doing some work, still working with Kaplan quite a bit, and I'm also offering my own AFM course through AMA Learn Online. Also have my YouTube channel, so I'm updating that more and more. So that's got loads of great free resources on for you guys. So that's at Andrew Moore AFM on YouTube. So you can find loads of free tips and things. I post quite a lot on there about AFM. So if you need any additional support, you can always check that out as well. So that's a little bit about me. Let's think about what the session is going to look at then. So first of all, we're going to give you some insights from the article called Read the Mind of the Marker. So there were 3 articles which ACCA published, which is really useful from the examining team. So we're going to be looking at what the markers are trained to look for when they're marking your scripts, how they award marks, and then a really important one for you guys with exams coming up, common reasons for losing marks. So what can you do to avoid throwing away those easy marks in AFM? We're then going to look at some technical examples from the Read the Mind of the Marker article. So that will include comparing different scripts, and I'll get you guys to have a think which script would score better, what do you like about certain things. and we'll discuss ways that they could improve their answers as well. And then at the end, we'll look at some practical advice. I'll give you some tips as to how you can prepare best for the December exams. I'm really going to focus in there about your timings as well. One of the biggest risks in AFM is about time management. There is a lot to do, and the time goes so fast. You know what it's like with these ACCA exams. 3 hours, 15 minutes. That sounds like ages, doesn't it? You could run a marathon in 3 hours, 15 minutes. But on exam day, that time goes like that. It goes so fast. It's incredible. It's ridiculous how quickly that time goes. So I'll give you a few tips about how to plan your time, how to manage your time properly so that you're ready come the December exams. At the end, as Martin said, I'm going to do a bit of a Q&A, so you can post your questions, and I'll be picking out a few of those questions to answer at the end of the session as well. So that is the plan. Right, let's have a quick look at some insights from the Read the Mind of the Marker article. So what we're going to look at here is what the marker looks for. Now, these articles are available for you to read, by the way, so go ahead and have a look at these as well. I've distilled the 3 articles and picked out some key bits, and also used some insight from my own experience and talking to markers to come up with a few really, really important points in here to start with. So the first one is about making sure you answer the verbs. So the markers are looking for you to answer the verb that they have set. So a really nice example in the specimen exam, which is what this article is based on, is the verb discuss. So when they say discuss something, a lot of the time they're looking for pros and cons. They're looking for a balanced argument. Rather than just listing out one side of the argument or looking at one thing, we're looking for a nice balance with that. So just look at those verbs and just see what they want you to do. Another thing the marker is looking for is a sensible approach. If this scenario has 3 different strategies, for example, in it, it'd be really nice to set that up, your answer, with the 3 strategies as subheadings, for example, so you can answer each bit in turn. So just have a think about that. And again, this is where planning comes into your answers and needs to form part of your time planning, is you need to come up with a way of doing this and answering everything in a really clear and logical way. The next thing is about adding value. So we need to add insight. There's no point just copying out the scenario or just almost repeating what they've told you in the question. You need to add value to your points. Now, I'm going to give you some really specific examples about that towards the end of the session. I'll show you like a poor answer and what you could do to turn that into a really good answer. And a lot of the time, it doesn't take that much. It's just knowing how to do it. So I'll give you some really specific insight into how we'll do that towards the end as well. So are you adding value to your answers? When you're doing calculations, you'll have heard this before, but you need to make them easy to mark. Just imagine you're a marker. So you've got all these scripts to mark. And with the exams being in December, a lot of these markers may be on their Christmas break, for example. They may be taking a bit of time off and sit in their family, but they've instead got to sit there and mark your scripts. You want to make these as easy as possible for them. What you need to do is, as soon as they open up your answer, they think, yes, this looks nice. I really want to mark this one. I see scripts all the time where you've got workings over here, workings over there. That bit relates to that. And you're going, where's this number from? Where is this going? So make it easy to mark. And believe me, you'll get more marks. Also, you need to focus on the professional skills mark. Now, this is a real passion of mine for AFM students because I think a lot of people neglect these, and there are 20 marks you can get for professional skills marks. If you get these right, you only need 30 marks from the rest of the exam to pass. Now, suddenly that sounds great, doesn't it? When you think of it like that, if you can get all of these professional skills marks, which you can, then you only need to get 30 elsewhere. So that sounds amazing. So remember what they're looking for. Communication, which will only be in question 1 in the big 50 marker. They're looking for a report format. They're looking at good style, language, and clarity throughout. And again, we'll think about that report format shortly, what they're looking for exactly with that. But they're really easy marks to get. Analysis and evaluation. So using the data correctly, showing really clear workings and doing conclusions as well. So making conclusions from the numbers that you've done. Again, not just doing a calculation, not just doing an MPV and leaving it. You are then actually commenting on what that means, and you're drawing conclusions from your calculations. Now, this is one that the examiner recently said students struggle with, which is professional skepticism. So challenging the information provided. So you've got to think, is that realistic? Are these numbers actually trustworthy? So when they say to you, oh, just assume that these cash flows carry on inflating at 5% forever, you should be thinking, that seems a bit unreasonable. Or just assume the tax rate stays at 20% for the foreseeable future. You're thinking, oh, well, actually, things are changing. And particularly with real world events at the moment, there are a lot of political events going on. If they say, assume the exchange rate stays the same, you could challenge that and say, well, hang on a sec. There's some really important things going on globally that mean exchange rates are quite volatile at the moment. So stating your assumptions, challenging that information is a really good thing to do when you're doing your calculations in particular. And also commercial acumen. So this is about making realistic points and recommendations and applying it to the scenario. So many students just write generic points that don't link to the scenario. So you've really got to make sure that you're linking it to the scenario you've been set. Think about the industry that company's in. Think about the products they're selling. Thinking about what their name is and their product names. Getting those into your answer will really help you to get those commercial acumen marks. Now, in terms of how marks are awarded, so for discussion points, you are looking at roughly a mark per point. So that's a really good basis to go with for this. Sometimes if you've had a really well-discussed point that's maybe in a bit more detail, you might get 2 marks, but it's safe to assume you're looking at about 1 mark per point. So if you get a 6-mark discussion requirement, I would aim for 6 short, concise paragraphs with spaces in between. So think of it like that. Obviously, that's related to the company and related to the industry, as we just discussed. In terms of calculation marks, you are looking at 1 or 2 marks per figure, depending on the complexity. Now, something that a lot of students aren't aware of, there are no half marks in AFM. So you can't get half a mark for that calculation. So it is either a whole mark or potentially 2 marks, depending on how complex that is. Also, don't forget the markers can see your workings. So they can see what the formula is behind the number in the spreadsheet. So that is always good to remember. You don't need to write it all out again. A lot of the time they can see what you're doing, which is brilliant. And with those professional skills marks I just talked about, those 20 marks that you get in this exam, that's based on your overall response. They're not necessarily saying you can have a mark for that, we can have a mark for that. It's more about overall, in that particular question, were you commercially acumen adding? Were you skeptical of the numbers you've been given? So it's more about the overall response rather than specific points. Right, the one that you're waiting for, common reasons for losing marks, and therefore what you need to do to avoid that. The first thing, poor time management. So too many students in FM don't manage to answer every requirement. The best thing you can do to deal with that issue between now and the exam, bear in mind we've got only a few weeks left before the exam, 3 weeks left, is practicing questions to time. I cannot emphasize that enough with AFM. You have to practice questions to time. So many students go into this exam and think, it'll be fine. I can work it out on the day. You've got to get used to what that time feels like. A really nice little tip is to have a timer on your desk as you're doing questions. So it might be that you use your smart speaker, it might be that you use your phone, as long as it's not distracting you, of course. But set a timer so you know exactly what it feels like to have that time pressure. Because that's the big thing, is that people do manage their time poorly. Also, students don't plan properly. So sometimes answers lack a structure. It's like you've just gone, just typing, just doing your calculations without really doing that. The way to fix that is to plan it properly and get all your headings and subheadings set up at the beginning of the questions. If you watch my debriefs on YouTube of the recent mock exams, the December mock we've just done, you'll see exactly how I do that. So before I even get into my answers, what I do is I set up all my headings and subheadings, get it all planned out first, and then I get writing. Otherwise, if you try and do it as you go, it's very easy to get lost. So get it all set up to begin with. Not adding value as well. So some students don't develop their points sufficiently. They'll just say, sales have gone up, this is good. Yeah, at this level, come on, you've got to add a bit more than that, haven't you? You've got to add a bit more insight. What can we add from the scenario? This may be due to their recent marketing campaign, which seems to have been successful. bring in stuff from the scenario and really make that point much more insightful. Using bullet points may be ironic given the format of my presentation today, but the bullet point in AFM sort of general trend that some people go with is not an ideal one. A lot of students then write in note format, which lack depth. So the examiners often say, don't use bullet points. It does tend to lead to too concise points. Write in short, concise paragraphs instead, and that's fine. A lot of students don't do a report format for question 1, even though it will ask you to do that. So we've got to think about how to do that. And again, I'll talk you through that a bit later on. Again, not relating to the scenario, writing generic answers. You've remembered your notes, page 24 of your notes, and all you've done is recite those. You've not made it relevant to the scenario. So that's another reason that a lot of students lose marks. And also, as we mentioned with the professional skills marks, missing those easy skepticism marks. If they give you some numbers, challenge them. You can say, right, that seems a bit optimistic. And what you've got to do when you're stating assumptions is say why it may not be valid. So they've stated that inflation will be constant at 5% forever. This isn't realistic, is what a lot of students say. Then you need to say why, challenge that. Given that this is a project in a new country, inflation is very uncertain, and therefore it's hard to predict what this is, or what the impact of that could be. So we're assuming that inflation is constant at 5% forever, but if it's not, that could actually turn this MPV into a negative one. So just adding a bit more to it. Doesn't take a lot, but just a little bit more, adding a bit more value to that, and suddenly you're getting those professional skills marks as well. So if you manage to avoid all of these, you're doing really, really well. So keep on out for that. Again, common reasons that we see in this article and from other bits of experience I've got that students are doing and therefore throwing away marks. So avoid those and you'll be in a really, really good position. Okay, now on to the article. So if anyone missed me saying just at the start there, these articles are available on ACCA's website, and I really highly recommend you go and read them. So there are 3. It looks at 3 questions. These are from the specimen exam, which is available on ACCA's practice platform. So you can go and do that exam. It's a good one. It's a really good one to practice. So these are looking at 3 questions. And what they've done is they've got 3 scripts from different students, and then they've looked at how they'd be marked and what sort of things the markers were looking for throughout the scripts. So I've taken extracts from these. I'm not expecting you to know exactly what the question was about. And equally, I'm not expecting you to read these responses in detail because that would take quite a long time. These are 3 full answers to a proper 100-mark exam. So it's not going to be a case of reading absolutely everything. But my purpose here is just to point out a few key things and a few key differences between different students' responses, what we like, what people could improve, and what the markers are looking for. So we'll have a look at them, and it really helps you guys just to understand, right, when I do my exam, I want it to be like that, or I don't want it to be like that. And sometimes it's really nice to see that from a marker's perspective. It's easy when you're in the exam just to keep writing, but actually, let's just take a step back. Let's just imagine you are a marker, marking these scripts over Christmas. There are jingle bells playing in the background, and you need to think, right, how am I going to make the marker really happy so that they give me as many marks as possible? So this is the requirement from the big 50-mark question. So this is the question 1 from the specimen exam. And we're going to look at here part A, which, again, we're going to look at this one in a reasonable amount of detail. So we'll just quickly read this requirement. Discuss the feasibility and effectiveness of the defence strategies of selling off individual garden centres and enhancing the director's remuneration. So that was a discussion part for 7 marks. As always, really important to look at the verb. So the verb is discuss, the feasibility and effectiveness. Then you've got part B, which is to prepare a report. There's your report format, by the way, for the board of directors, which does all those different bits. Again, we're not going to go into details of exactly what they want us to do in there. But as you can imagine, in AFM, quite a lot of that is calculation-based. So parts 1, 2 and 3 of part B are more calculation-based. And then at the bottom, as always, in your big 50-mark question, you've got your professional marks, 10 marks, communication, analysis and evaluation, skepticism, and commercial acumen. So we'll look at how these students coped with those and the sorts of scores they were getting. Now, just as a little bit of background around this question, this company King Tim, so they own a load of garden centres, hence the image I've put there on the left, in case you're wondering why there's a hand with some plants in. So they are all about garden centres. And there's a potential threat that someone might come in and try and take them over. So that's what part A was around some defense strategies. So the two things they were looking at is, should we start selling off individual garden centres to make it less attractive as a proposition for potential takeovers? Or should we enhance our directors' remuneration package so that if someone does take over, suddenly they get a big payout? So then they'd be less concerned if it did happen. So they were sort of the two proposals they put in there. So here is part A. So discuss the feasibility and effectiveness. And what I want to do is show you three responses. So we'll start with candidate X. So this is what their response was. Again, I'm not expecting you to read all of that, given the time we have. You can go and read this in ACA's excellent article, Read the Mind of the Marker. So this is question 1. So this is the first of the 3 articles. So this candidate has written out a little bit of a response to part A. If you read the first couple of paragraphs, so it gives you a bit of background at the top. That first paragraph they've written in here, actually doesn't really tell us too much about answering the question, does it? It's more repeating what the scenario is telling us. And then it says about they potentially making it less attractive. Then it's in that third paragraph where they say selling individual garden centres, and then they start approaching the question, and then it's changing directors' contracts. So they don't really start answering the question until those last 2 paragraphs. In this exam, you've got to be ruthless. You've got to get to the point. You can't give a bit of background at the start or almost repeat what the scenario is telling you. You're not going to have time. So we are going to have to be very, very ruthless, as I say, with your time management when we're doing this. So that's candidate X. So have a little think about that, how you thought they did. We've then got candidate Y. Immediate reaction. Okay, this is the same question. The big difference, they've written a lot more, haven't they? So they've written a lot more. Now, sometimes writing more isn't necessarily going to be the best plan. You know, you've got to be both concise but you've got to add enough depth to earn the marks. But in here, again, look at that first paragraph. It gives you a background. They're a nationwide chain of garden centres selling products such as plant, fertilisers, tool and garden furniture. Is that going to get you any marks? No, all we're doing there is just repeating the scenario, aren't you? So potential acquirers are looking to diversify. So can you see here, again, let's cut that. So again, I'm being quite harsh as sort of a critic of this answer, but I'd say, right, get rid of that bit. And then here, this is when they start saying, oh, we could start selling individual garden centres, and then we could enhance directors' remuneration. And actually in there, then they make some really good points. And then also about the fact around the shareholdings and things. But again, even this answer, which is written a lot, they could have made it a lot more concise. My other tip for this candidate would be this paragraph here, this one in the middle, the big one, is too long. Do you guys want to read that? Like when you see that, does it jump out as you thinking, oh, I really want to read that? I look at that and go, I've got to read all that. Have I really got to sit here and read all of that paragraph? It makes it hard for a marker to want to give loads of credit when it is just such a big chunk. So I'm all about short, concise paragraphs. Break that into little bits, and suddenly this answer would be a lot better. And actually, this student, again, has made some really good points, just needed to structure it slightly better, and this would be even better. Now, candidate Z, you can see the contrast here, can't you? Again, I like these 3 different scripts for this reason, because they are very different. This first one gives a little bit of a bit of background around, again, what the 2 proposals are. But then it says selling the garden centres and then enhancing the director's remuneration. Can you see they've done pros and cons of each? So they've done these pros and cons of each of these different scenarios. So very, very contrasting to the previous candidate. This one is very concise. Maybe you could argue too concise, but they've nailed the requirement, haven't they? They've gone, right, here's selling the garden centres, here's enhancing remuneration. So this is the pros and cons of each. So a lot more, the structure and things are a lot different compared to the previous one. Right, I'm interested to know your thoughts then. If you could just put into the chat for me, what do you think or who do you think scored the highest? So if you could just pop that into the chat, X, Y, or Z. Who do you think scored the highest of the three? So if you could put that into the chat for me, just to give me your ideas. So who do we think scored the highest? So we've got lots of Zs. Okay, lots of Zs. I might have led you with the way I described these things. This is Z. Okay, lots of you going Z. A few of you going Y as well. But one of you going X. Okay, interesting. So lots of Zs and Ys, I'd say. So just to remind you of the three. So that was Z. That was the sort of concise. Y was the one who wrote the most, and then X was the one that was sort of like somewhere in the middle. Okay, right. Yeah, okay. So yeah, Z, people are saying because they sort of focused on the requirement a lot more. So here we go. Not many of you said X. X scored 3 out of 7. So they got 1 mark for the top there, a little bit around agency. So there's a bit in there, they said. And then they only really wrote 1 point for each thing, selling the individual garden centres, changing the director's contracts. So they only really wrote 1 thing under each. So they got 3 marks for candidate X. Candidate Y picked up 5 marks. So do you see what I said earlier about that top one being a bit excessive? We didn't really need that, so no credit for that one. They picked up 2 marks for this around the selling individual garden centres, 2 marks for the enhancing the remuneration, and then a mark as well at the bottom talking about the shareholdings. So they picked up 5 marks in there out of 7, which isn't bad at all. Now candidate Z got 4. So by the way, if you said X, that was the highest score of the 3 responses. But what I found really interesting, look, a mark for that, a mark for that. So that pro, that con, that pro, that con, all picked up a mark. And can you see how much quicker that was compared to this candidate? So this candidate got 2 marks for writing this massive paragraph. This candidate got 2 marks for writing about 17 words. So do you see again, we've got to make sure we're adding enough depth and relating it to the company, but it isn't all about volume. You've got to have a really good structure as well, and that would really help. Now, I actually don't think that any of these 3 candidates answered the requirement in the most efficient way possible. So my response would have looked like this. And again, if you get a question like this, break it down, and this is really important in that planning phase. This is what my answer would have looked like, my plan. So discussion of the defense strategies, that'd be my first thing. I'll talk about timings later, but I would have allocated myself 14 minutes to do this. Selling off the garden centres, enhancing the director's remuneration. Those are my subheadings because it said there are 2 strategies. I'd have those as my 2 subheadings. And then do you remember the requirement said discuss the feasibility and the effectiveness of each of those? So I would then discuss the feasibility and effectiveness of each. Can you see suddenly that question becomes a lot more appealing, doesn't it? Can you see how much nicer that is now to answer? Again, for us as candidates and you guys as candidates, I want to go in and answer that now. I want to go and put in some points rather than all 3 of those scripts really, apart from maybe the 3rd one, apart from Z, who had a bit more of a structure. But the others sort of just going and just typing. So again, this is my point around how important it is to plan and get that set up at the start, and then you're going to be in a much, much better position. So yes, so much more. You can be so much more concise, and then you can go there. Okay. So that was that's again just a really nice illustration of what you can do, what you need to do to pick up the marks, and then also how important your structure is, especially with the discussion parts as well. Get those subheadings in, get those little sort of subheadings in, as I call them, the little feasibility and effectiveness, and you're going to be in a really good position. Brilliant. Right, so that is our part A. Now, part B. Again, part B is in a lot of detail, so I'm not going to go into each of their scripts. Again, you can find this article and you can see the full responses on ACCA's website, so you can get into that and you can have a look. But in here, this was a report to the board of directors, which then says estimates the cost of capital, before the new bond, then the market value and the cost of debt for new bonds, and also revised cost of equity and cost of capital. So lots of cost of capital stuff in here, which is a topic I love. So this would be great for me. And yeah, plenty of marks going. There were then also some discussion parts, as we saw earlier. So let's have a quick look at the responses. And I really want to focus on this report format. So what we think the candidates have done well and maybe not so well at. So here's candidate X again. So same candidate as before. And in terms of their report format, they said this report prepared to evaluate. So they've done a bit of an introduction and then they've gone straight into it. Would you say that jumps out? If you saw that, would you say, oh, this instantly, I know that this is a report. Is there anything in there that you think, this is definitely a report format? Does that jump out as being a report format to you for candidate X? Nope. Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, it's they're lacking a few things, aren't they? So what you should always do for report format is to have, I always start at the top with a 2 from subject and date. So I'll always put 2 from a subject at least. So have like a really clear thing at the top. Often a title, and then you want an introduction. Yeah, perfect. You want an introduction, and again, I'd label it introduction and underline it, make it really obvious. Now, this candidate has put an introduction there, but it sort of gets lost, doesn't it? So I'd literally write introduction, underline it, and then I put that point. Then what I do is I always put report findings, and then I put that in there. And also I then label it make sure you label it B part 1, B part 2, B part 3. Remember, this is an exam. I know we're doing a report, but it's also an exam that markers are marking. So you've got to make sure you're structuring it so that in a really clear way to mark. So that was my first thing I just wanted to point out on this one. So it does really lack that report structure. These are some of the calculations. Again, have a look at the calcs, and again, the calculations themselves, I'm not particularly worried about. I just wanted to show you some examples of what it looks like from a marker's perspective sometimes. And in here, can you see they've sort of labeled a few things, share capital, debt, but you're sort of thinking, well, what are these numbers? So where have these come from? What's that? You've got this one here. Then you've got it does say cost of capital, so that one's labeled. And then you've got market value of bonds and things. But can you see it's not, I wouldn't say it's particularly easy to understand where the numbers have come from. One thing I just want to point out with calculations in AFM marking, which loads of people ask me, is if I make one mistake here, will that then affect, will I then lose marks later on? There's something called OFR in the marking world. Does anyone know what OFR stands for? Have you heard of that? So I'll just have a quick look at the chat. Something called OFR. Has anyone ever come across those 3 letters? I don't know if anyone's ever heard of this in the marking world, but OFR stands for own figure rule. So what that means is if you have used an incorrect number in here somewhere, that's it, perfect, Natalie, yeah, that's the one. Yeah, that's it. If you've used an incorrect number up here, you then won't get punished again. So you could still earn your cost of capital even though your number earlier was wrong. And again, if you imagine an MPV or a hedging question, for example, that could be significant, couldn't it? Because if you get a number wrong early on, all the rest of your numbers would be wrong. So you can relax in the knowledge in AFM that if you make a little slip up early on, you're not going to lose the rest of your marks, which is really reassuring. So that's always a nice thing to remember. The other lesson that you should learn from that is just keep going, or just keep swimming. I always tell my students, any of you are on here from one of my courses, you'll hear that expression a lot, as you've already heard. Just keep swimming. You just have to keep going in this exam. If you're not sure about a number, if you get stuck and let's say you couldn't find the cost of debt, so let's say, I can't find this cost of debt, or I can't find this value for share capital, what should you do? So what's the best thing to do if you're like, I literally can't find that number, I'm stuck? What are we going to do? Yeah, okay, yeah, you're right, Adam, you're going to move on. What you can do is you can just make a number up, can't you? You can just literally just say, I'm just going to put in a number here. Just keep swimming, yeah, Dory mode, exactly, that's it. And yeah, just make it up and then just keep going. You can always come back to it later. You can always come back to it later on, but just put a number in, assume 10%, Marvin, perfect. 10% is always a good percentage to assume. and then just keep going. And yep, sure, the rest of your numbers won't be right, but you could still get 9 out of 10 marks for that section, even though your numbers weren't right. And as you say, Sienna, perfect. A sensible estimate is always a good way to go. So just keep going. Don't worry, and you can still earn the rest of the marks, which is always good news. Right, let's have a look at candidate Y. Report format is looking better, isn't it? So this is instantly looking a lot better. So we've got 2 from and the date, which is good. Introduction. So they've done that introduction. Now, at a recent conference I went to with the AFM examining team, they said the introduction can be really concise. 2 or 3 sentences is enough. So you don't need to write loads. This candidate's, probably that's the most you'd be looking to write for an introduction, maybe even shorter than that. So don't let it waste a lot of your time, but just make sure you're being very concise, and then you're getting on to your next bit. Even in here, I think they could have labeled part B1 slightly clearer, couldn't they? They've sort of gone into the calculations a little bit, but maybe part B1, part B2 would have been useful. But again, it's looking a lot nicer, this one. And again, you can then see, again, they've done an impact of this, and you can see they're picking up marks throughout. Just a couple of points I wanted to mention here. The calculations shown above are made upon a number of assumptions. I just noticed in the chat there when I had a quick look, one of you said that you've heard, whenever you're doing a calculation, almost to challenge, just get in the habit of challenging numbers. And you're absolutely right. If you're doing some calculations, just be thinking, how can I be skeptical of these? And this student's done that. This candidate's done that, which is good. Can you see B to D is assumed to be 0 for all relevant calculations? The equity beta is assumed to be the same, etc. First of all, they've done bullets, which, as I said earlier, often leads to not particularly in-depth answers. But I'd also recommend that this candidate were to challenge those assumptions more. So rather than just saying, it is assumed there'll be no change in the tax legislation for the near future, say, why is that not valid? So go into a little bit more detail, and then they will, again, potentially get a bit more credit. Now, it looks like in here, they've actually already maxed out the number of assumption marks. So it looks like they already got those. But they'd have been better off doing 3 or 4 assumptions and doing them properly, challenging them, writing them out, rather than listing 5 sort of quite concise. So you're better off doing 2 or 3 really good assumptions than listing out sort of 5 bullet points like that. Another really important thing for report format is a conclusion. So make sure you get onto a conclusion when you're doing a report. So just as a quick recap, what the markers for report format are looking for 2 from and the date, so with a bit of a subject, an introduction. They then want a conclusion. And when you're doing your calculations, they want them to be in an appendix. So as you can see from this candidate, they have put that into an appendix, which is really nice as well. And can you see just the layout of these as well is looking much nicer. So much more clarity as to around what everything is. There's VE, there's VD, there's KD, there's RF. So everything's much more clearly labeled, which is nice. This candidate has listed out the formula for each of these. You don't need to do that. Again, I've seen the markers or the examining team in the past say, you don't necessarily have to write out what the formula is. But if it helps you and make sure you get the right number, then that's okay. But I wouldn't worry about it too much. Then candidate Z, just a quick overview of this one. Again, you can have a little look. Again, somewhere in the middle, they've done an introduction, but there's no 2 from and the date. They've put a few assumptions in there, which is quite nice. Their calculations, again, were laid out fairly clearly overall as well, so not bad. Just want to show you how each candidate scored in terms of professional marks. By the way, overall, candidate X, so this candidate overall, for the whole thing, scored 18 out of 50. So they were just short of a pass. They got 5 out of 10 for the professional marks. So communication, they got 3, even though we said the report format wasn't amazing. It says they didn't fully adopt it, but the clarity in language wasn't too bad. So they did still pick up 3 communication marks there. They didn't particularly make good use of the data, and there wasn't really much of a conclusion. So only 1 mark for that. Skepticism, no real focus on skepticism in there. So that they didn't get any marks for skepticism. And then commercial acumen, they said maybe a little bit, so they might have applied it slightly to the scenario, so picked up 1 mark for that. So they got 5 out of 10 for the professional marks there. Candidate Y overall scored 37 out of 50, so a very solid pass for candidate Y, and they got 10 out of 10 on the professional marks. That's what you all want to be getting. So really good communication. Do you remember we saw that report format was the best by far of the 3, wasn't it, with the 2 from and the date? So that one was great. Analysis and evaluation was good as well, drawing good conclusions. Again, they weren't particularly skeptical. They did mention a few assumptions in there, but apart from those, which they asked for in the requirements, by the way, apart from that, they didn't really go above and beyond. So they could have done a bit more in there. And then commercial acumen, they picked up a couple as well. So talking about specific things to the industry. So they actually got 11, but it's capped at 10. So they only got the 10 marks. Candidate Z, they scored 26. So candidate Z, throughout all of this, was like, this was the concise candidate, wasn't it? This was the person who was making everything quite short, not writing a lot, but getting to the point. And this person, again, got 26, which is just about a pass. Communication, they got 4. Again, the report format was okay. Analysis and evaluation, they picked up a couple of marks there for you drawing conclusions. Only 1 mark for skepticism. Again, could have challenged a bit more. And then no real application to the scenario, so they didn't get any commercial acumen marks. So they could have just linked to the scenario a bit more in there, and they would have been in a much better position. So overall, they got 7 out of 10 on that. So that gives you a bit of insight as to what you need to do to get those professional marks. And again, that candidate Y was a really good example of how that works. Now, when you go and look at those articles, I changed up the order of the 3 candidates. So you might notice the order is slightly different, because otherwise they were sort of in order of best to worst in the article. And I wanted to add a little bit of drama to it at the start as to which candidate was best. So when you do that, you might see they're in a slightly different order, but you can go and read that, which is really useful. Okay, there we go. So there are the articles, and lots of things in there for you to go and read and take in. I now want to pass on my advice to you as an AFM expert tutor. What can I tell you guys that you need to do to pass the December exams? The first thing is manage your time properly. If you answer every requirement in this exam, you've got a really good chance of passing. Just remember that. If you answer it all, you've got a great chance of passing this exam. The main reason people don't pass is they miss big chunks of the exam. So you've got to be very careful. So my suggested timings, and again, when you watch the debriefs of the December exams that have gone live on ACCA's YouTube channel, you'll see I do this structure. I always do this. So for a 50-mark question, you'll have 98 minutes, which is 1.95 minutes per mark. So I always recommend you plan and read for the first 18 minutes. So that's getting everything set up, reading the requirements first, getting all your headings and subheadings laid out nicely, and then going and reading the exhibits. And then writing, you've got 80 minutes. So that is your time to write up your answers and obviously do your calculations. It's 2 minutes per mark. So I really like that because it's just nice and easy. If you've got an MPV to do for 10 marks, allow yourself 20 minutes. So it's just nice and easy. You just double the number of marks and that will give you your timing. And you've got to be so strict. Another reason that this exam sometimes doesn't go to plan for people is that they are caught up in the numbers. The numbers can sometimes be a real trap, and you can spend ages trying to find that perfect answer. Again, you can't. You've just got to keep swimming. So you've got to just be very strict with the timings and make sure you move on. And if you have to make up a number, that's fine. If you need to make up a whole MPV so that then you can talk about it in part B, okay, that's fine as well. So just be really strict with your timings. Then for 25-mark questions, everything's just halved. So you're going to have your planning and reading time is now 9 minutes. So you still need to read the requirements, plan out your answers with your headings and subheadings, and read the exhibits. And then your writing time is now 40 minutes. So again, you've still got 2 minutes per mark. It still works out nicely. And you've got to be, again, very strict with that. Now, obviously, that 2 minute per mark is not including the professional skills marks. They're sort of embedded throughout the questions. So I'm looking at 2 minutes per technical mark is what we're looking at there, not including the professional marks. Right, in terms of how you add value to your answers. I said at the start I was going to do this, and it's a really nice exercise to show you almost a poor answer and what you can do to turn that into a good answer. So this is a really common one. Investment appraisal comes up in pretty much every exam, so you're going to get something along these lines. NPVs, really, really common things. So you do an NPV, it comes out as negative, and students write, reject the project as the NPV is negative. Okay, right. The premise is fine, like your knowledge is okay, but how can you turn that into a more insightful and value-adding response? Based on the calculations and assuming the assumptions made are correct. Right, so now you're looking at being skeptical, great. XPLC, so drop in the company's name, should reject the project on financial grounds as the NPV is negative. So can you see now I've used a little bit more skepticism. I've also mentioned the company by name, so I'm just using the scenario a little bit more. And again, we're sort of saying there are other things to consider here, as well as the financials. It might be that this project has really good follow-on options, or it might have a really good real option attached to it. But based on the financial grounds, the NPV is negative. So you're just turning that into a nice little phrase. Again, it doesn't take long to write that, but you're just adding a lot more value to your point. And in terms of stating assumptions, I see this a lot. This assumes revenue will grow each year. Okay, yeah, true, fine. Yeah, that is a valid assumption, but we need to challenge it. Always think, how can I challenge that assumption? So what you could do is, this assumes that revenue will grow by 5% each year. Given this project is in a new market with unpredictable demand, this may differ, which would affect the NPV. So I've said why it's not valid, and I've talked about the impact that that could then have on my project as well. So again, that doesn't take a lot, does it, to go from that poor to that good? But just with a little bit of practice, just with a little bit of knowledge, which I've just told you now, you can suddenly turn those poor answers into good answers. And those are suddenly becoming a lot more like that candidate Y, sort of adding that little bit more detail, which is what you need to pass this exam. Okay, just quickly, a poll. Do you practice the mock exams? So if you could just pop that into your answer into there. So do you do the mock exams? So I believe you can just select your answer in here. So if you click on the screen, hopefully you can submit your answer. Do you want to try that? Yep. So rather than put it in the chat this time, yeah, you can. It's an interactive one, so you can click on the screen here, which is exciting. Okay, right, we'll just wait for a few more people. We're at 52% of you submitted, 58%. Okay, I'll just give you another few seconds. 61%. My friend Indifrike is a stickler for making sure everyone submits, but I'm gonna move on slightly sooner than he would. Where are we up to? 66, 69%. Okay, right, well, 70%. Okay, great. Let's have a look at your responses. So we've said, okay, 65% of you said yes, 12% of you said no, and 22% of you said sometimes. Okay, you know what I'm going to say here, don't you? These mock exams and doing mock exams to time is the best way to prepare for this exam. Nothing else compares to doing proper mock exams with the time deadline so you get used to it. We still get students going into this exam for the very first time doing a full exam to time. The first time they do it is in the real exam. And that is so difficult to do. So make life easy for yourself. Practice by doing these mock exams to time. You've got the December mock exam available on ACCA's practice platform. You've also got the practice exams. There are lots of other past exams on ACCA's website, which are free. And you've got my debrief for the December ones as well. So plenty of stuff on there for you to go and practice. But you need to make sure you do that. So my final bit before we get into some Q&A, and I'll look at your questions. So I'm sure we've got plenty of questions waiting, but you can add them to the Q&A. First thing, focus on how to earn the 20 professional skills marks. I did do a video on that. So I've posted a free video on my YouTube channel, which talks specifically about how to earn those 20 professional skills marks. So that's at Andrew Mower AFM, if anyone wants to go and watch that. So just make sure you really focus on how to get those professional skills marks. The second thing, practice questions to time. You need to make sure you know exactly what you need to do in the time. And again, set a timer, do what you need to do, but make sure you are getting that time pressure sorted. And as I said, practice the pre-December mock exam. So that got launched this week. And again, the debrief videos are on ACCA's YouTube channel for those. So do the questions to time and then watch the debriefs. And you'll see me go through it and I lay it out exactly as I would in the exam with all my headings, titles, report format, everything. So I do it exactly like I would in the exam. So make sure you do that and you're going to be in a really, really good position. Okay, right. Time for your questions. So we've got 10 minutes left and I'm going to have a quick dig into your questions. So let's see what we have got. Right. So I'm just going to have a look at my questions. I'm going to start right from the bottom and work my way up. So the very first question was from Chabala, which said, how do you practice using the BSOP calculator before the exam? Good question. So in ACCA's practice platform, the BSOP calculator will only be in questions when you need it in the real exam. And also that's the case in the practice platform. But if you go into the blank software, so if you go into ACCA's practice platform and go into the blank software, you'll see at the bottom, you've got the calculator, you've got the word processor. There's also then the BSOP calculator in there as well. So you can practice using that in there. So you can go and do that. Pooja asked any tips for the remaining days until the exam. So Pooja, the best things you can do for now is to practice questions to time. As I've said throughout this session, you asked that question right at the start of the session. So hopefully throughout that, you've picked up on the fact the best thing to do is to practice questions to time. Then if you get stuck on a particular thing, then you can go back to your notes and recap the theory. But the best thing you can do now is just keep doing questions. You start getting used to the question format and the little tricks sometimes that are in questions, and you start just getting a feel for it. So that is by far the best thing you can do from this point onwards, is just doing those to time. And also, I'll just add, just make sure you are allowing yourself time to relax as well, and allowing yourself time just to unwind. And yeah, I know it's an intense period for you guys with 3 weeks left before the exam, but make sure you allow yourself time to have a break. Schedule it in, spend time with family, go and see friends, get some exercise, get some fresh air. But honestly, you've got to look after yourselves as well over the last 3 weeks. Otherwise, if you go into this exam absolutely exhausted, there's no point. So practice questions and look after yourself are my two biggest things before the exam. For the calculation workings, so Sujit asked, do I need to show the breakdown, or is it okay to use the formulas? Absolutely fine to use the formulas, yep. You don't need to show a breakdown of everything. The markers can see inside the cells, so there's no need for you to go through and sort of show absolutely everything. It's fine. So Vijay asked, how do I develop to answer every theory question at the expected level of the marker? Again, Vijay, a lot of it's about, again, if you understand the calculations and the theory, then you'll be able to discuss it. I think candidate Z, although candidate Z didn't score amazingly in the ones I just showed you, but that first question, you saw how concise they were. And a lot of the time, the answers are in the scenario. So that's what I'd say as well, is just make sure. A lot of students see a question and think, I don't know, I can't remember. I don't know about defense strategies. It's fine. I'm not sure. But actually, if you read that scenario, if you went into the detail of that, then that would be... Sorry, a little interlude. So if you go into the scenario and you pick out the different things, you can see like a lot of the answers almost are in there. So you can just extract bits from the scenario, which is really useful as well. So yeah, use that as a little bit of a guide for your answers, rather than necessarily having to remember absolutely everything. Ashley asked, how many past papers is sufficient to get a good understanding of AFM? Is 3 years of past papers sufficient? It's an impossible question, Ashley. As many as possible. The more questions you do, the better. Like the more questions you do, the better chance you're going to have of being successful. So that'll be my advice. There isn't like a number. I can't say to you, you have to do this number to pass. It is a case of doing as many as you can. Zara asked, does 2 sentences per paragraph gain 1 mark or 2 marks? Again, quite subjective. I'd usually go on the premise of you can assume you'll get 1 mark per paragraph. If you do if you do a couple of sentences, so maybe 3 or 4 lines, something like that, so short, concise paragraphs, I'd work on the assumption you're going to get 1 mark per paragraph. That's what I aim for. Seppo asked, is it acceptable to use abbreviations for something like TAD, for tax allowed depreciation, stuff like that? Yeah, commonly used abbreviations like MPV, TAD, things like that are fine. I've seen a few slightly quirky ones, but yeah, if they're relatively commonly used, then that'll be fine as well. There is Monica's asked quite a technical one about lock-in rates. So which spot rate should be used, the buy or the sell? I've literally just done a video on which rate to use, Monica, on my YouTube. So you can have a look at that as to which way around the rates will be quoted. And it'll follow that same pattern as the spot rate. So you can have a quick look at that. Natalie asked, are you expected to leave a conclusion or recommendation even when the question doesn't specifically ask for one? Good question, Natalie. In the report format, definitely do a conclusion. So you want to summarize what you've done in question 1. So I'd always make sure you're doing a conclusion in there. Anything where there's like a bit of a decision to be had. So maybe if it's an MPV or if it's something like different hedging strategies and you're recommending which hedging strategy to go with, I'd always do a recommendation then as well, which one's best. So I would say if in doubt, doing a little conclusion or recommendation is probably quite a good thing to do. But definitely if there's any sort of decision like yes or no or anything, then I definitely would do that as well. Right. Sabo, you asked, do you need to, when you're doing a conclusion, do you have to specifically say yes or no, or can you say further research has to be conducted? They are looking for sort of decision-making skills in this exam. So I'd always recommend making a clear decision. So saying, based on, assuming the assumptions provided are correct and everything else, I recommend we do this because of X, Y, and Z. What you can always then do is add a caveat. However, I recommend that we do this, this, and this before making a final decision. So I'd always make a clear decision, but then maybe add a couple of caveats, and that'd be great. Right, I went through the skepticism, so I'm just going to do that. No, so you don't have to mention the formulae with words. No, that's fine. So you don't necessarily have to do that. Carl asked, do you have to add the comments in the spreadsheet after your calculations? I'd always do the discussion parts in the word processor. Leave the calculations for the spreadsheet, but then I do the discussion parts in the word processor. A few people have asked in the report format, what do you put your name as? You definitely don't put your actual name because there's a bit of a data risk if you're doing that sort of thing. I tend to put something like finance manager as my title. So when it's, we say to, from. They might say in this scenario, you are a financial advisor or whatever, but if they don't, I put finance manager or advisor or something like that is fine. Tamana asked, if you did an MPV and you got it as negative instead of positive, and then you did all your conclusions based on that, you'd still get the rest of the marks. So it's that own figure rule thing. You'd still get the rest of the marks. So even if your MPV is wrong, if your comments relate to the MPV that you got, even if it's positive when it should have been negative or vice versa, you'll still get those marks. So don't worry. Yeah, just keep going. Right. A few more. Have a quick look. So there are lots of questions. Apologies if I don't get through yours. I'm doing as many as I can. A few sort of general how do I pass type ones, which is fine. A few people asking about the order in which you do the exam. I just saw that. Yeah, start with section B or section A. Right, interesting question. I actually asked this to the examining team in the conference recently and said, where would you recommend starting? The examiner said that he'd do question 1 first and then do the section B questions. And I agree. I would always do the big 50 marker first to get it out of the way, so that then you're then left with the 2 shorter bits. When you're tired, having the big 50 marker left can be quite daunting. So I do the big 50 marker first. I then do the easier of the 2 section Bs and finish with the more difficult section B. So that's my approach, and actually that's what the examiner said as well. Okay, well, I think I've got through quite a lot of the questions. Apologies if I didn't have time, but we are out of time. But thanks ever so much for your attention. Thanks for all your great questions as well. Again, remember I'm on YouTube, so Andrew Meyer AFM. So if you want to get any of the free videos that I mentioned, you can have a look on there. But thanks ever so much, and best of luck with the exam. I really hope it goes well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much, Andrew, for those great insights and that great session right there. Just a quick reminder to all the attendees, the pre-December 24 mocks are now live on the practice platform. So please do find some time, attend the mocks in exam conditions. Once you complete, please self-mark your mock and watch the debrief videos. Because the earlier you can do that, then the more time you have to address any areas that you may identify that you need to put in a bit more work. So just to reiterate, the recording of this session will be available. You can access it through the same link you used to join, and that should be sent over to you tomorrow. And please also do have a look in more detail at the article, the Read the Mind of the Marker article. It wouldn't be possible to go over everything in this 1 hour. There's a lot of information in there. So please head over there and interact with that resource. So that's all the time that we had for the session today. Thank you so much, Andrew, for the session. Thank you to all the attendees for finding time to attend. And thanks to everyone as well in the back end helping with this session and answering the questions. From the rest of us at ACCA, it's best of luck in your preparations and all the best in your upcoming exams. Thank you and goodbye for now.